In August of 1777, American Brigadier General Nicholas Herkimer was ordered to bring 800 militiamen from Tryon County to Fort Schuyler in northern New York. 60 to 100 members of the Oneida Iroquois Nation, including chief warrior Yerry and his wife Kettles together, joined Herkimer's column near the Oneida village of Oriska. Unbeknownst to them, 500 enemy soldiers, the vast majority of them other Iroquois, led by the renowned Mohawk warrior Joseph Brant, lay in waiting around a deep ravine. In the ensuing ambush, Herkimer's column evaporated, its numbers cut in half in only about 30 minutes. Herkimer himself was shot in the leg, an injury which would prove fatal. Yerry was shot in the wrist, whereupon two Kettles together took to loading his musket for him, even as he swung his tomahawk and sword with his other arm. After 3 hours of fighting, thunder showers offered Herkimer and his men much-needed relief. With the rebels now positioned in defensive circles, the British allied Iroquois pulled back. For the Oneidas, or the people of the Standing Stone, the greatest sorrow that day likely did not spring from their failure to bring the militia safely to Fort Schuyler. Rather, for the first time in a major engagement, they had spilled the blood of their brothers from the Iroquois Confederacy. By the eve of the American Revolution, the 5 nations of the Iroquois Confederacy had already been in alliance for some 3 centuries. The Senecas, the Cayugas, the Onondagas, the Oneidas, and the Mohawks had formed a virtually unassailable confederacy, and so expanded their lands from the Genesee River to the Hudson River. In the early 1700s, the Oneidas welcomed the Tuscaroras, who had been forced off their lands by encroaching European colonists in North Carolina. Thus, the 5 nations became the 6 nations. Life, of course, changed dramatically with the arrival of colonists. At least 80% of the Iroquois succumbed to foreign diseases, dropping populations to precipitously low numbers. New ideas arrived with the colonists: personal property, farming, the domestication of animals, Christianity. In the mid-1760s, a Presbyterian minister named Samuel Kirkland arrived in the Oneida village of Kanonwalohale. His message resonated with the Oneidas there, whose traditional beliefs, like Kirkland's own, upheld a balance between individual freedom and sacrificial service to the larger community. By the 1770s, Kirkland's church boasted some 400 members. Traditionally, tribal power had resided in hereditary sachems. These continued to wield influence in the village of Old Oneida, where Christianity did not take hold and traditional beliefs endured. Meanwhile, in the villages of Oquaga, Oriska, and Kanonwalohale, chief warriors became preeminent. Most of these, including the revered Skenandoa, after whom George Washington is said to have named the Shenandoah Valley, had converted to Christianity. While of course no tribe was monolithic in its beliefs any more than the colonists were monolithic in theirs, by the 1770s religion and region had begun to shape new allegiances among the Iroquois. In the West, American contact and influence had been minimal. Thus, the British remained an invaluable resource to the Senecas, Cayugas, and Onondagas. After all, the British had guns and other essential supplies to trade. Meanwhile, the Oneidas had had significant and largely favorable interaction with American traders and missionaries. Many of them, like Samuel Kirkland, proved to be stout revolutionaries. As for the Mohawks, the easternmost of the Iroquois had experienced a trifle too much contact with the Americans. Treaties and land-grabbing colonists had forced them to abandon their traditional home. The Americans, as far as the Mohawks were concerned, were not to be trusted. Only weeks after the first shots rang out on Lexington Green in April of 1775, Mohawk warrior Joseph Brant recruited some 1,700 Native Americans, including hundreds of Iroquois, to fight for the British. Yet as Brant rallied forces for the crown, Skenandoa journeyed with Kirkland to New England to evaluate the Americans' chances of victory. Skenandoa was impressed with what he found: 15,000 troops in siege around Boston, and a tall, commanding figure in George Washington, who wisely took time to meet with the Oneida warrior. As the war progressed, the British increased pressure on the 6 nations to join Brant against the rebels. The Americans, they said, would never stop land grabbing, and only the British held them in check. The eastern Iroquois took heed of their warnings. By the end of 1776, reports came to Kanonwalohale that most Senecas, who were nearest to the British stronghold of Fort Niagara, now supported the king. In January of the very next year, the Grand Council fire at Onondaga, the symbol of Iroquois unity of mind, was extinguished. In the winter of 1777, British General John Burgoyne devised a plan to seize Albany, New York. While he led an attack from the north, Colonel Barry St. Leger would lead a diversionary thrust from the west. For St. Leger's attack, the British successfully recruited a large force of Iroquois, including Brant and his followers. And here the Oneidas' avowed neutrality proved paper-thin. Hitherto, the people of the Standing Stone had been content only to scout for the Americans. Now, they joined Herkimer's column in defense of their homeland. What followed, as detailed in our opening, became known as the Battle of Oriskany. In the aftermath of the bloody engagement, Oneida warriors would travel east in support of Horatio Gates's American army. There they would conduct raids on Burgoyne's troops, thus contributing greatly to the demoralization of the British prior to the Battle of Bemis Heights. In the end, Burgoyne's army was defeated and some 6,000 British soldiers were taken prisoner. In the spring of 1778, roughly 50 Oneidas traveled to the American camp at Valley Forge at Washington's invitation. An Oneida woman, Polly Cooper, brought much-needed corn to help feed the starving Continentals. Meanwhile, the men served under the Marquis de Lafayette in the Battle of Barren Hill. There, Oneida warriors engaged in diversionary skirmishes against the enemy, thus allowing nearly all of Lafayette's detachment of 2,000 to escape from a force 4 times its size. After the war, the Oneidas were rewarded for their faithfulness to the cause. On paper, at least. President Washington even signed the Indian Non-Intercourse Act, which prevented land-hungry third parties from negotiating with Native American tribes. Yet many Oneidas returned from the war to poverty and depression. They had suffered the destruction of 3 out of 4 of their main villages, Oriska, Oquaga, and Kanonwalohale. Family members had died. Moreover, the division between sachems and warriors, between traditional beliefs and Christianity, had never resolved. Factionalism, poverty, and a greater acceptance of European modes of living all made the Oneidas susceptible to accept offers for their land. By the 20th century, in direct contradiction of the Non-Intercourse Act, the state of New York and other speculators had purchased all but a scant 32 of what was once 6 million acres of Oneida land. As a result, many Oneidas relocated to Wisconsin and Ontario. On the 100th anniversary of Oriskany, some 75,000 people turned up for a celebration at the site of the battle. Alas, the speakers that day made no mention of the 60 to 100 Oneidas who so valiantly defended the American militia against Brant's ambush. General Philip Schuyler had once told the Oneidas that sooner should a fond mother forget her only son than we shall forget you. In the end, his words proved to be as fleeting as the wind they expired on, while Brant's warning of land-hungry Americans proved to be prophetic.